Today we're going to talk about Syria. I would call it opportunities that we want to look at. And this is an important hearing. For those of you in the audience, we're glad to have you. This is a public hearing, and we appreciate you attending and watching what we do. But participation is not allowed. So as I have said over and over again, if you interrupt the proceedings, if you try to get attention, if you try to distract the committee or witnesses in any way, you'll immediately be removed by our friends here who are working security and be charged, and also you'll be banned from the committee for a year. So with that, on our zero tolerance policy, I've got a few remarks I'd like to make to open. Then I'm going to yield to the distinguished ranking member for remarks. Then we have two excellent witnesses here, one an alumni of the staff of this committee, and so obviously well-trained. And we're anxious to hear their thoughts. The ranking member and I have been discussing this issue for some time, and I think there are opportunities here. Since the Hamas October 7th terror attack in Israel, long-held policy assumptions governing the Middle East have been turned on their head. Iran's ring of fire, which had encircled Israel with terror proxies and instability for decades, is now in ruins. Thanks to our ally Israel, Hamas is on its deathbed. The crown jewel of Tehran's terror groups, Hezbollah, is in tatters. Iran's weapons superhighway through Syria has been severed, and perhaps most shockingly, the Assad regime, a fixture of brutality, collapsed in what seems like an instant. The fall of the Assad regime presents policymakers with a dilemma. How should the United States engage with Syria? Should we engage with Syria? And at the same time, safeguard U.S. national security interests now that the Assad regime is gone. There's a very real trade-off between opportunity and risk. Too much engagement too soon could create more security dilemmas, but no or little engagement, too little engagement, could give Russia and Iran the ability to wield substantial influence again, and also signal that the U.S. has no interest, which would be an incorrect assumption. Make no mistake, there are very real dangers to lifting sanctions too quickly. After all, Syria's interim leader, al-Shara, has rebranded himself as a moderate, but he has supported some of the most violent terror groups in the Middle East. He fought under al-Qaeda in Iraq, worked under the Islamic State, and pledged allegiance to al-Qaeda, all in the past. In addition, Syria is rightly subject to a vast array of sanctions, to include sanctions placed on the Caesar Act, which I drew and all of us supported to get in place. Before the United States expands its engagement, several vital security interests need to be addressed, and I'm going to list four of those in just a minute. Going back to al-Shara, and we should be fair that he has been saying the right things, and much of the bad behavior that he committed, admittedly, is in quite a ways in the past. So let's talk about the things that need to be addressed if we're going to engage with Syria. Number one, following the tragic attacks in New Orleans, which was inspired by the Islamic State, and troubling reports of ISIS infiltration across the southern border during the Biden administration, we need evidence that the interim government will not allow Syria to be a launching pad for terror attacks against the United States or our partners. This includes full accountability and elimination of Assad regime's chemical weapons stockpiles. Second, Russia and Iran must be permanently ejected from Syria. Moscow must not have use of its port on the Mediterranean to threaten the United States or our allies. I'm particularly troubled by Damascus recently hosting a Russian delegation to explore basing agreements. Third, the Assad regime tragically turned Syria into a narco state, flooding the region with illegal drugs and fueling corruption and instability in the region. Additionally, this trade of methamphetamine and Keptagon served as a source of revenue for the Assad regime, undermining the impact of U.S. and international sanctions and wreaking havoc on Syria's neighbors. Assad's methamphetamine empire, with its sprawling infrastructure and literal mountains of inventory, has to be destroyed. Fourth, the interim government must account for American citizens detained by the Assad regime, including Austin Tice. This is a top priority for the United States and should be a top priority for Syrian leaders if they truly wish to work towards change in our bilateral relationship. Finally, al-Shara dissolved the Syrian constitution and appointed himself president for 4 years. Syrians deserve a realistic political roadmap that returns power to the Syrian people and does not fall back into a brutal dictatorship that threatens them or American security. On all of these fronts, the United States requires more than promises. If the new Syrian regime wants to have a friend in the United States, which the new interim government says that they do, we need to see action on the items I have laid out. If they do that, they will find a willing partner in the United States. In short, we must help and do enough to show the new interim government we are sincere in our desire to build an alliance, and at the same time, we must, with clear eyes, maintain the ability to disengage if they prove to be nothing more than just another authoritarian government with no respect for human rights or religious diversity. So, I know the National Security Council at the White House is working on a Syrian policy. I'm happy they're doing that. We're giving them our input. And what I would propose that they seriously consider what we're going to say here today. And I'm not talking about United States taxpayer dollars. What I am talking about is a gradual lifting of the Caesar sanctions that we've put in place. Let them come into place. Let's see how we're doing. Let's see how the new interim government acts. And if that happens, we will continue in a stream of lifting those sanctions. And I am urging, because time is of the essence here, that the National Security Council take this up as soon as possible. Until that happens, this is the policy of the United States I believe we should follow and that I'll be pursuing. With that, I know the ranking member and I share some common thoughts in this regard. We've spoken about it a lot, and like myself, she has spoken with a lot of the Syrian people and other people who have interests in the region. So with that, I yield to Senator Shaheen.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Risch, and welcome to our witnesses. Thank you both for joining us today. Let me also recognize, I understand we have some representatives from the White Helmets who are in the audience today. Let me thank you for your service to the people of Syria. I'd like to begin by asking for consent to enter 3 statements into the record, Mr. Chairman. The first is from General Mazloum, who is the commanding general of the Syrian Democratic Forces. The second is from the Syrian American diaspora, and the third is from NGOs who have been working on Syria assistance.
Without objection.
Thank you. Senator Risch and I, as he indicated, have spent a number of years working toward a better Syria. We are both relieved that after 50 years, the Assad regime has finally fallen. This was a regime that tortured and killed hundreds of thousands of Syrians. They forced millions to flee their homes. They gave an opening for terror groups like ISIS. They extended Vladimir Putin's reach and power into the Middle East. Assad's fall was a defeat for Putin. We want to make sure that it continues to be a defeat for Putin. He not only lost a deep-water port that allowed him to threaten NATO's southern flank, but he lost a reliable defense partner who gave Russia a decade to practice the military tactics in Syria that they're using today in Ukraine. So Assad's fall, as Chairman Risch has pointed out, creates an opportunity. It's a chance for us to rebuild from the rubble, a chance for the economy to recover, a chance for refugees to come home, and a chance to deny Putin, as well as Iran's Revolutionary Guard, a strategic foothold in the region. Tehran wants the Syrian land bridge to the Mediterranean and to its proxies. They want their UAV development and missile strikes sites back. They want to return to training security forces in Syria. Stopping them, I believe, is critical to U.S. interests and to our partners in the region, like Lebanon and Syria. I mean Israel. U.S. efforts in Syria are also key to preventing ISIS from taking advantage of the vacuum. ISIS has terrorized people across Syria and the region, and ISIS has radicalized and inspired lone wolf terrorists who have struck inside the American homeland. San Bernardino, California, Orlando, Florida, Garland, Texas, Ohio State University, New York, New Orleans. It's a very long list, and we should be doing everything we can to prevent this terrorist group from reconstituting itself. And it is not enough to leave the mission up to Turkey. We need to stand with our Kurdish allies and the entire global coalition to defeat ISIS. We cannot cut and run at this critical moment. That's why the foreign aid freeze and recent attempts to shut down the United States Agency for International Development are so disturbing. Mr. Chairman, I'd ask for consent to enter a summary on assistance blocked in Syria for the record as well.
Without objection.
Not only have these efforts meant cutting off programs to educate women and girls and help the very basic needs like delivering babies, they've directly undermined efforts to combat ISIS, to preserve evidence to hold Assad and his regime accountable for their crimes. We've heard that security guards have been at risk at Al-Hol, which is a huge detention camp in Syria, where ISIS is looking to reconstitute itself. We can't allow that to happen. Evidence that could help bring Austin Tice and recover Americans who have been murdered in Syria needs to be addressed. That's why I've asked Secretary Rubio to immediately issue waivers for aid to Syria, including to support the security of ISIS detention facilities. At the same time, we need to move quickly toward targeted sanctions relief. And we're not talking about throwing open the doors to the U.S. banking system. But these sanctions were put in place on the Assad regime. That regime is gone. If we don't reevaluate those sanctions, we punish all Syrians for the sins of Assad. Syria's transitional government needs to understand the expectations of the United States and the international community, and that means we need clear, measurable benchmarks for an inclusive government that respects the rule of law and protects the Syrian people. Sanctions relief will also help bring in the investments from regional partners and the international community that Syria needs to rebuild. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity, but it will not last forever. So I hope our witnesses will speak to the challenges there and the opportunities and help us think about how we can move swiftly to take advantage of the situation. How can we incentivize inclusive governance, transparency, and the rule of law? How can we support stability in Syria and prevent our adversaries like Russia and Iran from regaining a foothold? And what steps can we take in this short window of opportunity to keep Americans safe from the threat of terrorist groups like ISIS? So I look forward to hearing your testimony today and to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. And the matters of expenditures of U.S. Taxpayer dollars on a lot of these matters, as you know, are fluid and being reviewed. I have no doubt that this will get resolved appropriately in the not-too-distant future. So with that, we're going to turn to our distinguished panel. First of all, we're going to start with Mr. Michael Singh. He's the Managing Director and Lane-Swig Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He was Senior Director of the Middle East Affairs at the White House from 2007 to 2008, and a Director on the National Security Council staff from 2005 to 2007. Mr. Singh co-chaired the bipartisan congressionally appointed Syria Study Group with Ms. Stroul, who also joins us here today. The group released its final report on U.S. policy toward the conflict in Syria in September 2019. Much has changed since then, which is why we are here today, and I suspect both of you are as surprised as a lot of us were at the breathtaking speed and pace at which Syria changed. So with that, Mr. Singh, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Shaheen, members of the committee. It's great to be back with you to discuss this subject at a time that I agree it's fraught with risk, but it's also full of hope. And the question before us really is, how do we seize this opportunity that both of you, I think, have eloquently and accurately described, while getting around the many obstacles that there are to actually realizing some of these positive benefits. And I frankly find a lot to agree with in both of your statements, and I'll try to avoid repeating it. So look, first, the opportunity. You've both described it. Syria has been, for years, a Star Wars bar for U.S. adversaries in the region, whether that's ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Iran, Russia. It's been the platform for power projection for those adversaries, where their actions have not just been confined to Syria, but they've used Syria to try to attack Israel, to destabilize Lebanon, and so on and so forth. And the conflict in Syria over the past 14 years hasn't remained confined to Syria. It's drawn in numerous foreign forces, including ours. It's sparked massive refugee flows to Europe and to Syria's neighbors. It's led to, as you mentioned, to Syria's rise as a major narco-trafficking state, something which we hadn't seen before, and even saw the first use of chemical weapons in war for decades, since I think World War I. And when you go through that list, it's absolutely clear that the emergence of a new and better government in Syria would represent probably the starkest and most positive change of the many changes that the Middle East has seen since the heinous attacks of October 7th, 2023. But we're a long way from realizing that opportunity. We can see it, but it's not yet within our grasp. What are the obstacles? So first, both of you mentioned Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the group that has taken Damascus, and its leader, Ahmed al-Sharaa, and his background. It does seem as though Sharaa and HTS have sincerely, as far as we can tell, broken ties with ISIS and with Al-Qaeda, and even cracked down on those groups within the territory they previously controlled in Idlib. But HTS continues, as far as we can tell, to adhere to a rigid and intolerant Islamist ideology, and it's reflected in the way that they governed Idlib, which was repressive towards minorities and towards women, towards dissent, and it was also authoritarian. Sharaa's rule was unchallenged in Idlib. HTS, for the past several years, since at least 2018, has tried to reassure us that we are not their enemy, and that they want to work with the West. But there, I would say, are unmistakable parallels between the rise of HTS and the re-rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan, which made a lot of the same promises that we're seeing now from HTS, and hasn't obviously followed through on those promises. Second obstacle, as both of you mentioned, ISIS is not defeated. And in fact, we've seen a resurgence in ISIS attacks, according to CENTCOM, over the past year. And I think there's a lot of reason to worry, just from initial reports, that ISIS is trying to use this time of instability and transition, to mount a comeback. And there's a lot of reason to worry that they could try to free those fighters and those family members that both of you mentioned, who are in northeastern Syria, hoping that, we'll take our eye off the ball or otherwise the situation will break down. Third, I think there's a real risk that a new chapter of conflict could open in Syria, whether that's between Syrian factions as HTS tries to consolidate its power, or as Turkey tries to seize territory and target Kurdish fighters, including those making up the SDF with which, as you know, we work. And then fourth and finally, my view is our adversaries are going to try to regain their footing in Syria. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, Russia wants to salvage a role for itself. China's role was modest under the Assad regime, but they may see strategic and economic opportunities here. And even Iran, which I don't think the new government of Syria is going to like, will try to take advantage, as it often does, of this poorly governed space and to try to work through proxies. So what do we do? How can we seize the opportunity and get around these obstacles? Briefly, let me recommend the following. First, we need to continue to prioritize our counterterrorism operations and partnerships. We cannot ease up the pressure on ISIS. Second, I do think we should engage pragmatically with HTS and test its willingness to cooperate on areas of shared concern, like countering Iran and ISIS, counter-narcotics, border security, and so forth. And we need to watch and see if HTS is truly committed to more inclusive governance, which is, I think, the key to long-term peace and stability, and the key to our interests as well. Third, I do think we should take a phased and performance-based approach to the relief of sanctions, which is something absolutely Syrians will need as they go forward. And then finally, as we look at the bigger regional picture, I lay out a full agenda in my written testimony, but several things are key. First and foremost, we have to work assiduously to ensure that Syria never again falls into the orbit of Iran, and we can't cede the ground of Syria to Russia and China. Second, we need to work in lockstep with our Arab partners. We didn't do this in Iraq after 2003. And what happened was those partners shunned Baghdad, and we and they left it exposed to Iranian domination. We don't want to see that happen here. Third, we need to reach an understanding with Turkey that it should respect Syrian sovereignty and refrain from actions that are going to undermine stability or our interests there. And then finally, we need to take this opportunity to try to cement Israeli-Syrian non-aggression understandings, which could eventually lead to actual peace between Israel and Syria, which is something we've sought for a long time. It's a full agenda, but I agree it's a historic opportunity, and seizing it, I think, is going to take patience, pragmatism, but most of all, American leadership. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Now we'll turn to Ms. Stroul. She is the Director of Research, and Shelly and Michael Kassen, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. As mentioned, she co-chaired the Syria Study Group with Mr. Singh in 2019 before leaving the Institute from 2021 through 2023 to serve as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, the Pentagon's top civilian official with responsibility for the region. Prior to joining the Institute in 2018, she served for 5 years as a senior professional staff member of this distinguished committee, where she covered the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey. Undoubtedly, you have some thoughts on this, and we'd love to hear you, and welcome back.
Thank you so much, Senator. Chairman Risch, Ranking Member Shaheen, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. 5 years ago, serving as a co-chair of the Syria Study Group alongside Mr. Singh, what we testified then was that Syria and a robust U.S. engagement in Syria is in the American national security interest. And we also said at the time that the drivers of conflict in Syria remained, even though there was an assumption that the Assad regime had won, the drivers of conflict would leave Syria perpetually unstable. And I think those recommendations have borne out. The Assad regime had not won. We failed to understand how hollowed out his tenuous hold over Syria was. But the main point that I want to make here is that those drivers of conflict remain today. And if there is not a concise, coordinated effort to address those drivers of conflict, the risk is that Syria falls back into conflict, which is what happens in most post-conflict societies that have experienced this kind of deadly conflict for as long as the Syrian people have. The risks are too high, and I think it's worth noting, again, both of you mentioned these in your opening statements, what the risks are because of how Syria under Assad served as a base from which terrorism and instability radiated across the region, affecting our national security as well as that of Europe and the Middle East. Under Assad, Syria had a nuclear weapons and a chemical weapons program. He emptied his prisons of violent Sunni extremists during the U.S. war in Iraq, which led to al-Qaeda in Iraq and an insurgency against U.S. forces. He used chemical weapons, which remain in the country today. Torture, barrel bombs, starvation, and other brutal measures against the Syrian people, sending millions of refugees fleeing for safety, which still affect the stability of our partners today. He granted Russia a naval base on the eastern Mediterranean, remained Iran's one strategic ally in the region, and allowed Hezbollah and various Iran-backed groups to attack U.S. forces and Israel from within Syria. His regime produced and smuggled the narcotic Captagon across the Middle East. And finally, his brutality and unwillingness to address the drivers of conflict in Syria made the seizure of Syrian territory by ISIS and al-Qaeda a reality. With Assad out and a new transitional government in, we have an opportunity to shape outcomes in Syria that protect American interests, specifically with respect to counterterrorism and counter-Iran objectives. But events on the ground and international engagement with Ahmed al-Shara are outpacing U.S. policy. We must urgently update our approach to the post-Assad Syria. No surprise, I'm going to agree with a lot of what Mr. Singh said. I think a U.S. policy review must answer the following three questions. Engagement. What commitments does Washington seek from Damascus's new leaders? Sanctions. What actions are required in order to begin the process of providing expanded sanctions relief and lifting state-level sanctions on Syria? And 3 is the U.S. military presence. What are the necessary conditions in order for the U.S. military to transfer its counterterrorism mission in northeast Syria without risking the reemergence of ISIS? We should engage the new government in Damascus and set out a series of benchmarks to assess whether Ahmed al-Shara, Syria's unelected president who grew out of al-Qaeda, is willing and able to govern in a manner that does not further destabilize Syria and the region or threaten American interests. Examples of benchmarks: appropriate counterterrorism action against ISIS, al-Qaeda, its affiliates, and Iran-associated groups, limiting acts of violence outside the rule of law, and enabling transitional justice and accountability, holding him accountable for the transition timeline he set out himself, including drafting a new constitution, ensuring equitable representation in governance and resource distribution, and recommitting to the 1974 disengagement agreement with Israel. Now, building on what Mr. Singh said about counterterrorism, there is no alternative to the U.S. military and its local partner, the SDF, for the Defeat ISIS mission. The U.S. should reaffirm our commitment to maintaining U.S. forces in Syria, lest all the gains against ISIS be squandered. We should also begin consultations and planning for the conditions under which we could transfer the military mission without breathing new life into ISIS. Though the administration announced important exemptions to the assistance freeze for life-saving humanitarian aid, non-aid is just as important. This committee has played a critical role for more than a decade in oversight of assistance to groups like the White Helmets, NGOs working at ISIS detention camps, stabilization programs in communities liberated from ISIS, and the documentation of war crimes. Cutting off programs that help communities recover after surviving the brutalities of either Assad's rule or ISIS without plans to transition funding or services to non-U.S. actors will exacerbate the drivers of conflict that will keep Syria unsafe. Moreover, the dismantling of USAID and anticipated reduction in State Department career personnel, the U.S. government risks losing critical technical expertise in implementing U.S. programs and the delicate work of engaging post-conflict countries. The United States is safer if Syria is stable and can address threats rising from within its territory without outside intervention. In turn, a more resilient Syria promotes greater security across the Middle East, leading to more stable countries and prospects for widened economic and security cooperation with the United States. Finally, a Syria that is not destabilizing, attacking, or antagonizing its neighbors, Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Turkey, is also in the U.S. national security interest. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today.
Well, thank you to both of you. It's obvious we have the right people here to talk about this, and I think it's also obvious this is not a partisan issue. And I think we ought to all work together to get to a place on foreign policy as it relates to Syria.